Hey everyone! Tonight we're stepping into one of the most mysterious Mossad operations of the 21st century, a mission whispered about in fragments, buried beneath years of silence and secrecy. It wasn't about assassinations or double agents this time. It was something colder, quieter, a kind of infiltration that didn't use bullets or bombs, but something far more dangerous. Before we dive in, hit like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely love stories from the hidden corners of history. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I love seeing who's awake with these secrets, night after night, all across the world. Now, settle in. Picture Beirut, a city being rewired, rebuilt, and watched. Somewhere beneath its streets, Mossad was already listening. But the question that would haunt them for years wasn't what they heard. It was who was listening back. It began with a pulse that no one heard. A faint oscillation inside a buried cable beneath Beirut's southern suburbs. Just another signal among millions, except this one didn't belong. It was deliberate, precise, born from hands that knew the anatomy of wires better than human touch. The city above was loud, chaotic, drowning in the rhythm of commerce and politics, but beneath its skin, a silent operation had already begun. They called it Cedar Net, not on paper, not in briefings, but in the whispered language of those who worked where legality faded into purpose. The mission was simple in design, impossible in execution. Infiltrate Lebanon's expanding mobile network, trace Hezbollah's hidden command lattice, and do it all while pretending to build what everyone else thought was progress. The engineers arrived quietly, men who spoke in the clipped precision of Europeans contracted by a telecom firm racing deadlines. Their ID cards were flawless, their invoices authentic, their presence unremarkable. Beirut's reconstruction had opened a gold rush of connectivity. No one questioned new faces with cables and blueprints, but every reel of fiber they uncoiled carried two destinies, one for the nation's future and one for the shadows that watched it. The lead operative, codenamed Erez, spoke little. He didn't need to. Every gesture was calculated, every silence a mask. He knew that the closer they got to Hezbollah's communication arteries, the less the enemy would rely on encryption, and the more they would rely on geography, on physical cables, on something he could touch. By day, they blended with the noise of progress, clattering drills, shouted measurements, the metallic echo of manholes opening to reveal darkness. By night, they transformed those same conduits into listening veins. The fiber tap was no bigger than a fingernail, an impossibility of design, a prism that split light into information. Erez once told his junior, "Wires remember everything. The trick is to ask the right question." That line would echo long after the mission ended. The first intercept came 3 weeks in. It wasn't a voice, but a signature, a routing anomaly between two southern nodes, one in Dahi and another across the Litani line. To anyone else, a simple technical hiccup. To Erez, a whisper through static. Someone was using the civilian network to bury command traffic under a flood of normal communications. It was camouflage at a national scale. He scribbled a note on the margin of a fake work order. Find the ghost relay. That was the point of no return. Every operation has a moment when logic surrenders to instinct. For Cedar Net, it happened in the heat of an afternoon when a real contractor nearly uncovered their embedded splitter. A loose panel, a misplaced question, and suddenly the air thickened with fear. Erez moved fast, covering the anomaly with a wad of insulation foam, laughing it off as shoddy installation. The worker grinned, shrugged, and walked away. When the van doors closed that evening, no one spoke for minutes. Only when the hum of the generator drowned their breaths did Erez mutter, "That's how close the wire cuts." Night became their ally. They operated when the city's power dipped, when the hum of transformers hid their tools. Under sodium light, the team threaded fiber through manholes, whispering in code words and hand gestures. Beirut's air carried the scent of dust and diesel, the constant reminder that peace was a temporary illusion. Somewhere above them, Hezbollah couriers moved with equal precision, believing their communications were invisible. But Cedar Net was already inside their bloodstream. The ghost didn't sleep. It moved through packets and pauses, through the faint hum of idle routers, whispering back to the very hands that had created the breach. Within hours of Cedar Net's shutdown, the safehouse systems flickered. Brief, almost imperceptible bursts of returning data. Not random noise, but rhythm. Someone was mirroring their last transmission, sending back fragments of the same encrypted signature they'd used. It was impossible unless the network itself had learned to echo them, or worse, unless someone on the other side had found the tap and was playing with it. Erez watched the patterns on his terminal, jaw tight. "We woke it," he said quietly. Rami didn't answer. He just stared at the glowing lines that pulsed like veins, realizing for the first time that information could taunt. The order came from Tel Aviv before dawn: stand by, analyze nothing, transmit nothing. But the instruction only deepened their unease. If Hezbollah had located a compromised node, they could trace it backward through physical conduits, straight to the cover operation. Erez didn't need to be told that one wrong maintenance log, one van sighting, one loose contractor report could unravel years of preparation. By morning, he had already burned the local SIMs, dismantled half their portable intercept gear, and scrubbed their credentials from every telecom terminal they'd touched. Beirut felt smaller by the hour. At the Ministry of Telecommunications, a rumor spread that an internal systems audit was underway. The pretext was foreign technical interference. But everyone understood what that meant. Checkpoints multiplied around the southern districts, and local police began cross-verifying work permits. The men in suits were no longer inspectors, they were watchers. The European cover company started receiving quiet inquiries about subcontractor records, site schedules, crew manifests. The facade was cracking. To compensate, Erez shifted strategy from access to observation. They would go dark but stay nearby, watching which cables were cut, which nodes were suddenly taken offline. From these reactions, they could map Hezbollah's suspicion itself. "Counterintelligence is just intelligence seen in a mirror," he told Rami, his voice flat, exhausted. The young technician nodded, though his eyes betrayed panic. He knew his face had been seen too many times by local workers. Beirut wasn't a city that forgot faces. Days blurred into each other. The hum of servers replaced sleep. The intercepted traffic they dared to monitor now came through ghost channels, rerouted civilian circuits carrying bursts of meaningless static, as though someone was baiting them to listen. Every few hours an anomaly would appear, a burst of foreign metadata from a location they'd once tapped, or a familiar frequency pulsing under a false ID. It was as if the network had become self-aware, its operators on both sides probing each other through the same invisible veins. One evening, Rami returned to the safe house with a torn newspaper clipping, an article buried deep in the local pages. A mid-level telecom supervisor had been detained for irregular network activity. The name wasn't familiar, but the coordinates listed in the report matched one of their earliest installation sites. Rami dropped the paper on the table. "They're closing in," he whispered. Erez skimmed it, then folded it neatly and placed it under a half-empty coffee cup. "Then we move faster." Faster meant risk. The team reactivated the backup node in the northern sector, an emergency relay they'd avoided because it was too exposed, too close to civilian monitoring stations. But it was the only link they had left to pull the last fragments of data, an attempt to understand what the ghost really was. The connection came alive at 2:13 a.m., faint but coherent. For 12 seconds, their systems filled with a cascade of garbled packets, each carrying partial routing tables and burst headers from the core exchange. Then the feed went dead. The log showed something extraordinary. The last timestamp originated not from Lebanon, but from an intermediary server in Damascus. Hezbollah's network wasn't local anymore. It was regional, alive across borders, beyond their initial map. The next day, their handler from Tel Aviv, operating under the alias Yona, made contact through the emergency channel. His message was short: "Abort before exposure. New priority is extraction. But to Erez, extraction meant failure, and failure meant leaving the ghost unclassified. He'd spent months dissecting signals that behaved like thoughts, tracing a communication web that seemed to anticipate interception. It was more than espionage. It was evolution. He couldn't abandon it. Rami disagreed. "We've done enough. They're already looking for us." His voice trembled, not from fear, but from fatigue, the kind that blurs right and wrong. "If they find me, they won't ask questions. They'll make me disappear, and you'll just vanish with your cables." Eris didn't reply. He was already staring at the network map on the wall, lines of ink, loops, and annotations that looked more like a constellation than a diagram. Somewhere in that maze was the command hub, the pulse that guided Hezbollah's encrypted communications. If he could trace one last path, he could complete the picture. So he stayed. That night he slipped out alone, driving the van through half-lit streets toward a maintenance tunnel beneath the southern ring road. Rami followed hours later, against his own better judgment, carrying a toolbox and a small black case that housed their last optical tap. The tunnel was narrow, dripping condensation, the air thick with static from power lines. Erez knelt by the cable junction, stripped a sheath, and attached the splitter in silence. "This one stays blind," he murmured. "No signals out, just a recorder." It was a dead drop for data, a silent witness to whatever passed through those fibers in the next 12 hours. They left before dawn. By the time the first maintenance crew arrived, the device was already working, quietly harvesting encrypted light. But something unexpected happened. At 7:22, the recorder's buffer filled faster than it could process. The data wasn't just transmissions, it was queries. Someone or something inside the network was scanning the relay for signatures, searching for traces of the very intrusion Cedar Net had built. The ghost wasn't just awake, it was hunting. That same morning, 3 unmarked cars rolled into Dahia, stopping near a telecom substation. Men got out, not in uniform but carrying authority in their movements. Within minutes, a section of the fiber line was cut, and the station sealed. Word spread among local workers. A suspected foreign interception had been discovered. Erez and Rami, listening to the radio from their flat, didn't move. They just stared at each other, understanding that their worksite had just turned into bait. Rami broke the silence. "We have to leave." But Erez's eyes were on the recorder's blinking light. The buffer was full. The data, whatever it was, had been captured. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes not from relief, but resignation. "We got it," he said. The next second, the lights flickered. Power cut. Across the city, multiple substations went offline simultaneously. A blackout meant to mask something larger. When the lights came back, their connection to Tel Aviv was gone. For 2 days, Beirut felt suspended in an electric silence. Rumors circulated of foreign agents, of cables found with embedded chips, of captured technicians confessing under duress. Erez and Rami hid in an abandoned flat near Hamra, surviving on instant coffee and static-filled radio reports. The walls vibrated faintly from generators outside, the city's heartbeat reduced to mechanical rhythm. Rami asked if the mission was over. Erez shook his head. "Not yet. We still don't know what the ghost wanted." On the third night, Erez accessed the recorder's storage. The data was corrupted, half unreadable. But amid the chaos of numbers, one fragment stood out, a line of text buried in the binary code. It wasn't random. It was in Hebrew. Rami leaned closer as Erez translated softly, the words barely audible. "We see you." For the first time, Erez felt something colder than fear. It wasn't Hezbollah. It wasn't any known signal format. It was their own cipher reflected back at them. He turned off the screen, sat in the dark, and realized the operation had crossed from espionage into something unclassifiable. The ghost wasn't just awake, it had learned their language, and the network itself has begun to whisper back. The words on the screen were simple, cold, and impossibly close. "We see you." They landed like ice in Erez's chest and stayed there, widening the space between thought and action. If a message could be a footprint, This one had been left inside their shoe. It meant someone had not only found their scent, but had learned its pattern well enough to mimic it, to speak in the cadence they used to hide. It meant the mirror had gone from reflection to mimicry. They moved with the speed of men who understood the arithmetic of seconds. The safe house emptied into muffled shadows, laptops in packs, drives in pouches, the small tools that had once represented control, now symbols of exposure. Yona's voice came through the emergency frequency, terse and flat, ordering immediate extraction. "Get out, now!" The command was precise, the tone that carried the authority of something halfway between a suggestion and a verdict. Erez inhaled and felt the gravity of an entire apparatus pressing on him. Every plan had an off-ramp. Some were paved with compromise, others with ruin. They chose neither. Instead, they split the difference, keep the footprint, but change its shape. Over the next 36 hours, they staged the disappearance of their operation with theatrical care, fake manifests, a burned driver's log, a staged equipment theft 2 neighborhoods away from their real exits. Contractors in Beirut were accustomed to oddities. Logistics errors happened all the time. A missing van would be filed under insurance claims and bad luck. That was the hope. Their real objective was smaller and purer. Buy time to understand who had spoken those 3 words in their language. Rami wanted to leave. He wanted to find a cheap flight to the coast, a ferry, anything that would dissolve him into distance. Erez watched him try to move and knew the face betrayed him. He wore guilt like a second skin. "You can go," Erez told him. "If you leave, take nothing that connects to us." Rami's hands trembled as he crammed a few clothes into a bag. At the door, he paused. "If I go, will you tell them I wasn't part of it?" Erez hesitated only a breath. "No," he said. "I won't speak for you." Rami's jaw set. He left before dawn. Alone, Erez sat with the map again, ink and light, and the ghostly routes they had traced. He had mapped more than cables. He had mapped habits. The way messages bent at particular exchanges, the times when couriers preferred landlines over mobiles, the minutes of silence before a strike. Habits, he thought, were the soft underbelly of any system. Change the habit, and you change the animal. He needed to know whether the person who had written "We see you" had the same understanding, or whether they had merely parroted a phrase they had intercepted and learned to weaponize. The first real clue arrived like a worn coin in the gutter, unremarkable until cleaned and studied. A maintenance report filed by a civilian crew in Mar Mikhael listed an anomalous splice found in a junction box. The description was vague. Unregistered coupler, likely contractor leftover. Whoever had written it had circled the phrase leftover twice. Whoever had found it had not pursued it with urgency, but circled words hinted at human curiosity, and curiosity in such a place was its own danger and its own gift. Erez called an old favor and had the report quietly pulled from the municipal server. He studied the coordinates and matched them to their internal diagrams. The site was a peripheral node they had only touched once, months before, during a routine fiber lay. Whoever discovered the coupler had not been one of their crew. Whose eyes would be in the cables weeks after they had left? Whose hand would have traced the plastic housing and thought, in the middle of a city that sees 1,000 things a day, that this was worth circling? It pointed in one direction. Someone local had not only found a device, but had the patience to document it. Patience implied time. Time implied planning. Whoever had left the message back on their screen had not stumbled across their operation by accident. They had been waiting. The waiting had a pattern. Erez began to look for it in places the other men would ignore. The cadence of lunches, the frequency of coffee runs, the timing of van departures. He revisited raw logs, the low noise parts of the recording where human breathing and the hiss of air conditioning lived. Audio leaves more than voice. It carries breath, the subtle nervous hitch that reveals life under duress. He played back a clip from an intercepted call, slowing it, listening for anything beyond the words. There it was, a laugh, soft and nervous, followed by the clack of a work boot against a metal grate. That boot had a pace. That pace had a rhythm. The only person who matched that rhythm in their files was not an outsider. It was Rami. Erez did not want it to be. The thought tore through him like a fracture. He had trusted Rami. The young technician had been the thread connecting them to the neighborhood, to the men who actually opened the junction boxes and fed them coffee, while casual men in suits watched the lines. If Rami had been turned, if he had been coerced or had flipped under pressure, then what they had built would not only be compromised but weaponized against them. Instead of accusation, he chose surveillance. He began to shadow Rami quietly, watching from a distance as the technician did small tasks, fixing a rooftop antenna for a pensioner, buying a bag of bread, standing in line at a telecom office. Rami's life had not changed. His gait was the same, the worried furrow behind his eyes unchanged. But innocence is not a simple thing to prove when the world is practiced at interpreting patterns and proffering meaning. The next break came from a source Erez hadn't expected to trust, a call center operator who worked nights at the exchange near the port. She had watched their installation crews come and go, and when she noticed the blackout patterns, she pulled a small favor. "We have logs," she said, voice low, the cadence of someone who had learned how to wedge favors into conversations. "There's a machine pinging at odd hours. It asks for status, then waits. Machines leave signatures as clearly as men. The ping originated from an internal diagnostic system that had been seeded with an unusual test ID. That test ID, stamped across multiple exchanges, matched one of Erez's own, but with minor alterations. Someone had cloned their instrument. Clones needed creators. Tracing the ping led to a company number registered to a European subcontractor they had used, except the contract had been terminated 2 months prior. The number routed through an intermediary in a building on the far side of the city, a place that by coincidence housed a security consultancy whose clients preferred anonymity. Erez's chest tightened. The consultancy's receptionist was a woman with a neutral smile and a shoebox of cigars behind the desk. Her name didn't appear on the public roster. When he pressed, she offered an address. A small office in the basement with a metal door and no windows. Inside, a man with a shaved head and a smile that could be folded into anything sat behind a low desk. He sipped tea that tasted of lemon and secrets. "We help keep networks healthy," he said. "Sometimes that means telling a client when a foreign hand is trying to listen." His words were neutral and dangerous. "Who is your client?" Erez asked. The man shrugged. "Clients change." He left Erez with a folded business card that had no contact details, a gesture of those who understand both how to be invisible and how to be seen. Erez left the consultancy with more questions than answers. If the ping originated from a cloned instrument, then someone had both the means and the taste to simulate their tools. Simulation implied knowledge not only of technique, but of intent. The mirror had been crafted by someone who had studied them as much as they had studied their target. Back at the flat, he replayed the clip of the message one more time. "We see you." The phrase had the ring of taunt and of warning. It could have been sent by Hezbollah to unnerve, a message designed to push them into mistakes. Or it could have been sent by a third party, agents who wanted them to reveal their methods to test whether the operation could withstand exposure. Or worse, it could have been an inside job, someone who had access to both sides, someone who played at being local and foreign with equal talent. The more he dug, the more the lines blurred. Financial trails dissolved into cash contracts, safe numbers routed through shell companies and charities. Faces shifted. An engineer's handshake felt rehearsed. A driver's grin too timely. The city itself seemed to conspire in misdirection. Beirut had always been an island of pragmatism in a sea of conviction. People made deals with reality. They learned not to pry. The ones who did pry had learned to cloak their curiosity in the ordinary. Then came the betrayal that was clean and brutal and small enough to fit inside a cigarette pack. A young operative assigned to archive their intercepted calls, a man with an ease for numbers and a mother's voice on the telephone, failed to report for a scheduled transfer. He had been due to move a set of drives to a safe courier and never appeared. At first, they assumed a simple delay. An hour became 3. 3 became the kind of absence that rearranges priorities. Erez sent out tracers. The man had made no calls since he left the flat. His last ping came from a payphone near a mosque. Payphones are relics, but relics preserve scent. They found him 2 days later in a holding cell at a precinct that didn't like to ask questions. He hadn't been tortured. He had been polite and silent. When Erez finally sat across from him in a dim room and the man looked up, the eyes were not those of someone who had been broken. They were those of someone who'd been convinced. "They said we were spies," the man told him, voice flat. "They said we killed people with information. They asked for names, and we gave them none." He smiled a small, melancholy smile. "They told me as long as I answered questions honestly, they would let my mother keep the bakery." The arithmetic of coercion is simple. A family's safety on one side, an abstract notion of duty on the other. Most numbers choose family. It was a blow that landed in more ways than one. If they could coerce a junior archivist, they could coerce others. If they could plant doubts in men who had been raised to fix cables and carry nothing else, they could cause hesitation in operations that required the absence of hesitation. The operation's logistic skeleton, its chain of small, trusted acts, was vulnerable to human calculus, threats, and small mercies. Erez felt old in ways his years did not justify. He had thought war was about battalions and bullets, about firm lines drawn and held. This was erosion, quiet, patient, morally ambidextrous. He found himself imagining the moment a husband chose bread over secrecy, a wife chose safety over loyalty. Those were decisions made in kitchens, not war rooms, yet they altered the map. Pressure mounted from another direction. Leaks began to trickle into obscure dispatches. An op-ed in an obscure regional paper alleging that foreign contractors had been tampering with national networks. A blog post with a screenshot of a maintenance schedule. The press was not coordinated. It was a scattershot of insinuations, but insinuations swarm like insects. They find your face at a picnic. Tel Aviv's posture hardened. Intelligence chiefs preferred clean options: expose and deny, or withdraw and obfuscate. The moral middle ground tasted like ash. Amid the chaos, an unexpected thread unraveled: Yonah. The handler who had ordered them to pull out had a history that did not match his calm demeanor. Erez pulled old files, records of Yonah's earlier assignments, whispered reports of methods that leaned toward theatricality. He discovered that Yonah had once managed operations that used disinformation as a tool, planting false leads, arranging staged arrests, using rumor as a weapon. That style fit the current pattern: false leads appearing in the press, staged finds in junction boxes, cloned instruments designed to lure. If Yonah were using the operation to bait a larger net, whose net would it be? His own? The agency's? Or a rival's? Erez confronted him over a cold channel. Yonah's voice was smooth on the line. "We needed to see how deep they could dig," he said. "Sometimes you let a little noise happen to observe the response." The explanation felt like a surgical incision. Observation as method, observation as experiment. "But why put lives at risk?" Erez asked. No answer came that satisfied, only the kind of bureaucratic shrug that treats collateral as a checkbox. Betrayal, Erez realized, wore many faces. There was coercion and there was calculation. Both could be lethal. The mole hunt tightened until it became its own beast. They began to plant controlled leaks, false maintenance reports, dummy couplers seated in predictable places. They watched how the city reacted, measuring who read, who recorded, who reported, and who moved. They watched for the way an ordinary man's petty curiosity transmuted into action. Some of the traps were too obvious. Some returned nothing. But one small bait produced a result: a phone call from an unlisted number with the single phrase, "Stop looking," and then a click. The number traced to a prepaid card purchased at a pastry shop 3 blocks from Rami's mother's house. Erez felt the world narrow. He understood the mathematics of leverage. He had seen how a phone card in a street stall could become a chain that reached into clinics and banks and the small domestic economies that kept people breathing. He began to see the operation not as a series of clever moves, but as a lattice of obligations, of favors owed and favors called in. Beirut had its own gravity. Once you entered its field, everything you did had a consequence that bent towards someone you might love. He called Rami and asked him directly if he had bought a card at the pastry shop. Rami hesitated, breath snagging like a thread. "I thought it was safer," he said finally. "I thought if I used local, no one would trace me." The confession landed like the click of a trap. Erez's voice was quiet. "Who did you tell?" Rami's answer was soft. "No one. I didn't want them looking at me." It was an honest, stupid kind of lie, the kind born from fear. The night before the planned extraction, they watched the city from 2 vantage points, preferring distance to proximity. Yona ordered them to meet at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts. It was the kind of place that smelled of oil and old deals, perfect for handoffs and perfect for ambush. Erez felt the itch at the base of his skull, the animal sense that something was wrong. They arrived and found the warehouse empty, except for a single chair under a bare bulb and a cup of coffee still steaming. The coffee's heat meant it had been poured within minutes. A folded paper lay on the chair with a single line, "Turn yourself in, and we spare the network." No signature, no time, just a demand and its implied menace. Around the edges of the paper, faint prints smudged as if the writer had been wearing gloves. Erez folded the paper back into his pocket and looked at the empty space. This was no longer about pins on maps. It was about leverage. Whoever had written the note had either the audacity to communicate across the front lines or the degrees of control that made audacity possible. The message was not an offer. It was an ultimatum. It was a promise of violence masked as mercy. He thought of the young archivist in the cell who had given nothing for the bakery and lost everything anyway. He thought of Rami and his pastry shop card, of the maintenance worker who had circled the word leftover in the report. The operation scaffolding was laced into the private economies of a city under strain, and those economies were not rational. They answered to hunger and fear. In the end, the decision was made like all eroding things are made, slowly, through attrition. They would not meet Yona at the warehouse again. Instead, Erez sent a single message through a dead channel: "We stop." It was a lie, operationally elegant. Yona, if he had been baiting them, would be watching for a certain kind of obedience. Deviation might buy them a measure of safety, or at least confusion. The message that followed, minutes later, was a single, unreadable burst of code. Erez translated it as best he could. "Stay out of sight. We will talk." Whether it came from Yona or from someone else who had intercepted Yona's channel mattered less than its effect. It bought them breathing room. They scattered then, not so much retreating as folding into the city's skin. Rami found his mother and sat with her in silence, watching the bread she made cool on the counter. The young archivist was released a week later, not with apologies, but with a simple, rough-looking envelope and a small amount of money to make sure he kept his head down. People are quiet when money is whispered into their palms. It's a way of buying silence that no interrogation can always secure. But silence, as they all knew, is rarely honest. The city hummed on. The ghost remained, sometimes an echo on a line, sometimes a shape in a maintenance log. It had changed them in ways that were not simple. Erez found that he could no longer read the map without expecting ambush. Every junction box was a possibility, and every friendly face a question. He felt older, not by years, but by the accrual of decisions made in gray. And yet, in the quiet that followed the storm of arrests and notes and vanished men, a single image returned to him with persistent clarity. A junction box in Mar Mikhael, its lid lifted, a circle drawn around a coupler, the word leftover circled twice. Someone had looked, had cared enough to mark it, had perhaps thought it nothing malicious. Small human acts matter in ways both bureaucratic and moral. The coupler had been both a seed of compromise and a kind of map, depending on who read it. In the end, perhaps the most dangerous thing was not the technology, but the human calculus that surrounded it. The choice to report, the choice to hide, the choice to sell a secret for bread. Weeks later, when the dust settled into a brittle memory, Eres received a packet with no return address. Inside was a single page with a line of text typed in a machine that tried hard to be inhuman. "You mapped our anatomy well. We map your conscience." There was no signature and no indication whether it had come from Lebanon, Damascus, or somewhere else entirely. It was a lesson disguised as a compliment. He read the line 3 times and felt, as he always did now, a cold efficiency in the thought that what they had done would reverberate. They had learned a system's structure and exposed it. In response, someone or some system had learned to expose them in turn. The dance of spycraft had shifted, slow as tectonic plates, and with each move the map reconfigured. Eres folded the paper and put it in the compartment where he kept small, useless things, a token of a life divided into operations. He looked at the map on the wall one last time before taking it down and burning the margins, an act that felt almost ceremonial. When the last curl of paper went into flame, he realized that Cedar Net had not ended with a single victory or defeat. It had ended by teaching both sides a new lesson, that networks are not merely technical constructs, but living ecosystems of people, habits, and compromises. Once you touch the living thing, it changes. He walked out into the city the next morning and watched as a delivery man threaded a new spool of fiber through the same streets they had walked months before. The man worked with practiced ease, oblivious to the long shadow their work had cast. So it goes, thought Eres. Life resumes around the wounds, but wounds leave scars, and scars, when read properly, tell stories. The ghost had learned their language. They had learned to listen to a ghost. Neither side had yet learned what it meant to hear itself, reflected back with intent. The city seemed to breathe around them, indifferent to the hours they had spent threading silence into the veins of its network. Beirut had returned to its habitual hum, vendors calling across streets, motors growling through alleys, children chasing balls over cracked concrete. But beneath that noise, the memory of Cedar Net lingered, invisible yet insistent. Eres walked through it all with a vigilance that no amount of distance could wash away. The operation had ended on paper, but the aftershocks were still moving through wires, people, and conscience alike. Tel Aviv didn't call immediately. The agency's review boards liked to sit in silence before pronouncing judgment, letting the dust settle into a pattern they could analyze. When the first directive arrived, it was not a commendation or a reprimand, but a cold, precise instruction. Compile every data point, every deviation, every anomaly observed during the operation, every byte traced, every human interaction recorded, and every subtle choice made in the field would be cataloged. Cedar Net was to become a case study, not for the public, not even for casual internal briefings, but for the inner circle that ran hybrid operations at the intersection of SIGINT and HUMINT. Eres complied, his hands steady, his mind tracing the same routes they had mapped in the field. The city above remained chaotic, indifferent, yet every fiber he had touched felt alive beneath his fingers as he reviewed logs. The ghost, he realized, had not gone away. Whoever or whatever had mirrored their activity, left signs, and pushed back against their network had embedded a permanent presence in the system. It was a living warning, a countermeasure with no name and no face. The first aftershock came not from Beirut, but from Damascus. Data intercepted months after Cedar Net suggested that someone had used their cloned instruments to siphon signals across borders. Hezbollah's command nodes, once hidden behind civilian traffic, were now being monitored from a position they hadn't anticipated. The implication was staggering. Someone had learned their techniques, copied their methods, and was now using Cedar Net's own blueprint against them. Eres stared at the logs, fingers tracing connections like veins. and realized that operational security alone could not account for human adaptation. The second aftershock was quieter, but no less profound. Rami had returned to his mother's bakery, blending into domestic life as if nothing had happened. Yet, in private moments, he disclosed details to Erez that unsettled him. Patterns he had noticed, anomalies in service calls, whispers of surveillance that had gone unrecorded. These were small things, fragments, but when combined with the mirrored pings and cloned equipment, they painted a picture of a network that had grown self-aware to human interference. Cedar Net had left a residue that Beirut's telecom grid and its guardians would never forget. Within Mossad, the operation became a subject of both admiration and caution. Analysts debated the ethics of deep cover mixed with invasive surveillance, weighing the intelligence gains against the human cost. Junior operatives studied the mission's methodology as a blueprint for future hybrid ops, but they were warned repeatedly: technique without discipline, without an understanding of the psychological landscape, could turn success into disaster. Cedar Net was cited as a masterclass in hybrid espionage, but also as a cautionary tale about the fragility of trust and the weight of choice. The third aftershock came unexpectedly. An anonymous packet arrived at Erez's desk in a secure facility months after the team had disbanded. It contained a single file, a map overlaying Beirut's fiber network with subtle annotations in a hand that mirrored his own. No sender, no explanation. The note attached read only, "We remember what you touched." The meaning was ambiguous, but the implication was clear. Whether it was Hezbollah, a third party, or someone inside Mossad itself, Cedar Net had sparked a chain reaction that would ripple through regional intelligence operations for years to come. Erez reflected on the human calculus of the mission. They had seen loyalty, fear, and coercion intersect in ways that no algorithm could predict. Rami had chosen family over secrecy, the young archivist had withheld everything at personal cost, and yet even their choices had contributed to the long shadow of Cedar Net. It was a lesson in the unpredictability of human behavior, in the way minor decisions cascade into operational consequences. Every action had a reaction, and every reaction left an imprint. As the intelligence community debriefed, they began to connect Cedar Net's methodology to later operations. Hybrid SIGINT human missions across the Middle East increasingly employed similar tactics: covert embedding of listening devices within civilian infrastructure, careful mapping of human networks alongside technical networks, and the anticipation of mirrored surveillance or countermeasures. Cedar Net became a template, though always whispered about, never publicly acknowledged. The moral ambiguity of the mission, the manipulation of civilians, the psychological pressure on operatives, the exposure to unknown adversaries, was never sanitized. Yet, for Erez, the final aftershock was personal. He understood that even when the operation was considered a success, they had altered the intelligence landscape permanently. Hezbollah's command structures had shifted, learned, adapted. The ghost they had awakened in Beirut's cables was not a singular entity. It was a process, a system capable of reflection and response. Cedar Net had proven that in modern espionage, networks are as alive as the people who navigate them, and that every human intervention carries consequences that reverberate far beyond immediate objectives. Walking through the streets of Tel Aviv months later, Erez thought about Beirut. He thought about junction boxes and couplers, about the young technician and the archivist, about the invisible paths they had traced and the unseen eyes that had traced back. He understood the operational truth. Intelligence is never static. Loyalty is never absolute. And the ghost of a network, once awakened, never truly sleeps. And somewhere, far beneath the surface of a city that hummed with life, the cables pulsed quietly, carrying signals whose origin was now as mysterious as their own reflections. Cedar Net had ended, yet it had also begun something enduring, a conversation between human and network, between observer and observed, whose echoes would shape every hybrid mission that followed. Beirut had returned to chaos, Mossad had returned to analysis, but the ghost remained, awake, patient, and learning. The ghost had not left. Even months after Cedar Net, Erez could feel its presence in the quiet hum of servers, in the idle vibrations of fiber, in the subtle ways a city's pulse refused to synchronize with expectation. Mossad's internal review began with charts and tables, metrics of uptime, data exfiltrated, and gaps discovered, but the real report unfolded in whispers behind closed doors, in half-glimpsed concerns over loyalty, competence, and unseen compromise. Analysts debated each move of the operation, arguing over the necessity of exposing operatives to human risk versus the intelligence gained. Every decision, once tactical, now seemed moral, ethical, and dangerous in retrospect. Erez watched the sessions with a measured detachment, though beneath it simmered a quiet fury. How can an operation be evaluated when its adversary has already evolved, mirrored, and learned? Rami's presence, once a comfort, had become a question mark. He returned to Tel Aviv under the radar, silent in deference to the rules of the field, yet every gesture, every hesitation, every careful glance carried the weight of possible compromise. Erez observed him, noting the subtle tics that betray awareness, the tiny adjustments in posture, the way a hand lingers on a doorknob, as if anticipating an unseen observer. Trust, in intelligence, is not given. It is earned in microseconds and erased in hours. Erez understood that the boy had survived, but survival does not guarantee innocence. The city, once a simple backdrop for their infiltration, had become a mirror reflecting every choice back at them, magnifying the consequences of small acts into strategic dilemmas. Across the Middle East, networks were rearranging. Hezbollah had adjusted its nodes, rerouting traffic through unanticipated paths, embedding redundancies to frustrate observers. Every cable they had touched, every fiber they had spliced or mapped, had become a blueprint for the enemy's own resilience. Intelligence was no longer about extraction alone. It was about anticipating adaptation, predicting reflexes in living systems that learned from their wounds. Erez felt the full weight of Cedar Net's unintended education. In teaching them to listen, they had taught others to hear and respond with precision. Inside Mossad, tensions simmered. Debates over methodology often descended into subtle accusations. Who had allowed operational details to leak? Was it an oversight, an error, or something more deliberate? Analysts pored over logs, tracing pings and equipment deployments, searching for discrepancies that could signal betrayal. Erez sat quietly in these sessions, listening as colleagues parsed intentions, measured loyalty, and weighed risks. In espionage, suspicion is a currency as valuable as cash, and its circulation can destabilize even the most disciplined operations. The first tangible fracture emerged in the form of an intercepted communication, not from Hezbollah, but from an intermediary in Beirut, a signal that mirrored the cadence of their own transmissions. It was clever, precise, and unmistakable. Someone had studied Cedar Net as meticulously as they had executed it. The implication was chilling. Whoever this new player was, they were not only aware of Cedar Net's methods, but capable of deploying them in a controlled, targeted manner. The game had evolved from direct infiltration to meta-intelligence, understanding the operation, predicting the response, and manipulating outcomes without ever being seen. Rami, though physically unharmed, carried the psychological weight of exposure. One evening he confided to Erez about subtle interrogations he had endured from unknown actors, questions framed as casual conversation, but loaded with implications. "They didn't ask about Cedar Net," he said, voice low. "They asked about me, my routines, what I notice when I walk the streets." Erez understood immediately. They were probing for habits, patterns, vulnerabilities. This was not about intelligence gathering alone. It was about creating a map of human behavior, a lattice of predictability that could be exploited. As the agency studied these developments, Cedar Net was formally codified into Mossad doctrine. Future operations would blend signals and human intelligence, but with new caveats, Constant rotation of operatives, redundant observation of every node, and the expectation that any network touched might fight back in unforeseen ways. Analysts noted that even small oversights, an unlogged visit to a junction box, a casual conversation with a local contractor, could generate long-term exposure. Cedar Net was no longer an isolated mission. It had become a living lesson, a case study in operational humility. Yet, lessons, no matter how carefully documented, cannot inoculate against human fallibility. The young archivist who had once been coerced for his silence remained a cautionary emblem. He had returned to civilian life, carrying only faint recollections, yet the emotional toll was indelible. Erez considered this often, imagining the quiet lives disrupted, the minor compromises that accumulated into systemic vulnerability. Each human interaction, once seemingly insignificant, could evolve into a breach. The moral calculus was unending. Intelligence work was not a ledger of wins and losses, but a ledger of trust, fear, and choice. Then came a subtle but undeniable threat. Anonymous messages sent through dead channels, each containing partial data or manipulated logs, each implying surveillance, each whispering of consequences. They were not direct commands or orders, but the kind of messages that erode certainty. Erez studied them, tracing the digital signatures and finding only imitation, not origin. The Ghost had learned their tactics, creating its own rhythm, a shadow network that mirrored intent without ever replicating identity. It was intelligence as reflection, a system capable of anticipating and challenging every move. The psychological impact rippled through the agency. Field operatives were now hypervigilant, re-examining routines, questioning colleagues, and measuring every action for exposure. Analysts debated endlessly over what constituted compromise, what could be attributed to error versus deliberate betrayal. Erez, accustomed to calculating risk in seconds, now measured it in months, tracing hypothetical scenarios in his mind as if rehearsing a game that had no conclusion. Amid this tension, subtle operational victories emerged. Analysts detected anomalies in Hezbollah's network, a trace here, an unexpected echo there, suggesting that Cedar Net had forced adaptations that exposed new patterns. These glimpses of insight were tentative, fragile, but they demonstrated the continuing utility of the mission. Intelligence, Erez realized, is a long game. Moments of clarity are often separated by months or years of noise and uncertainty. Rami, gradually regaining confidence, began to participate again in minor operations, each assignment a test of loyalty and resilience. Erez watched carefully, noting the careful attention with which the young technician measured risk, weighed observation, and calibrated action. Every movement was deliberate, every choice intentional, as if Cedar Net had left an indelible imprint on the way he understood operational reality. The internal narrative within Mossad grew darker as well. Questions of ethics intertwined with questions of necessity. Were civilian contractors manipulated beyond the bounds of acceptable risk? Had the operations hybrid methodology created more vulnerabilities than it mitigated? Analysts wrote reports weighing intelligence gains against psychological and ethical costs, and debates raged quietly behind secured doors. Erez, aware of the ongoing debate, understood the truth of hybrid espionage, that the human element, curiosity, fear, loyalty, was both an asset and a liability, and that every mission left residues that no algorithm could fully quantify. Finally, months after the formal conclusion of Cedar Net, a package arrived at Erez's safe location. Inside was a simple USB drive, encrypted and unsigned. Its contents were subtle: logs, anomalies, and a set of slightly altered routing maps from Beirut's southern districts. Whoever sent it had intimate knowledge of both the operation and its impact. The accompanying note was terse, typed, neutral. "We continue to watch. So should you." Erez held the note, feeling the weight of everything Cedar Net had achieved and everything it had unleashed. The city, the network, the people, and even his own team had become part of a lattice of action and reaction, trust and compromise, observation and reflection. Cedar Net was no longer a mission. It was an ecosystem. The ghost was not gone. It had proliferated, learning from every decision, every exposure, every human choice. And in that quiet, lingering awareness, Erez understood the fundamental truth of modern espionage. Operations never truly end. They evolve, echo, and sometimes, in the hands of adversaries or mirrors of themselves, take on lives that surpass the intentions of their creators. Cedar Net had taught him that the network is alive, the ghost is patient, and intelligence, no matter how meticulously gathered, is always subject to the unpredictable calculus of humanity. In the days that followed, as Beirut and Tel Aviv moved in their separate rhythms, Erez returned to the maps, logs, and the lingering echoes of cables and couplers. He knew that somewhere in the web of fiber, behind the masked patterns of daily traffic, the ghost waited, observing, learning, and whispering in the language of reflection. Cedar Net had ended, and yet, as he traced a finger along the network, he realized it had only just begun.